Welcome to this video on disaster recovery processes. As part of the disaster recovery strategy, there is a variety of process that must be accounted for as part of the disaster recovery plan. And that's what we are gonna talk about here in this video. Now again, disaster recovery is making sure that critical business assets and processes remain operational. And this can be local asset or on-premises assets, and they can also be off-prem, which are remote or cloud-based. If you remember from previous video, disaster recovery is all about the steps necessary to recover the technology infrastructure. So we are worried about information technology and assets that are necessary to support critical business functions. That's part of our business continuity planning, where we identify those critical business functions or those services and the assets that are used to provide those functions and services. And that's where disaster recovery kicks in. Okay, it's very clear difference and it's important to know for the exam. So the DRP is gonna focus on things like server, workstation, website, database, and so on. And that's where all of the processes comes into play. So the DRP or the disaster recovery plan will allow personnel to clearly understand all of the necessary steps that are required to recover technology assets, whatever those might be. The best point of reference for this is the NIST Special Publication 834, the Contingency Planning Guide for Federal Information System. It's one of the most complete guides for DRPs that I have certainly worked with. And I know there's other assets out there, but this is the one you are likely to see on the exam. So that's what we are going to discuss for the remainder of this video. First of all, let's talk about recovery process itself. During the recovery, it's easy to get distracted by technology part. But again, the top priority is the safety and security of human life, by far and away. That is our priority. Then we are going to focus on communication, because that's paramount to understand the safety aspect and also the security aspects for human life or personal. We have to be able to communicate, and that's part of our process. And all of other processes within the DRP are going to be focused on personal first. Now, it may be in a situation that you have a disaster or disruption that human life is not at risk, and that's okay, but at least you perform the due care and due diligence to ensure that human life is protected. Then we can move on to the technology side of thing. You never know what happened in disaster situation, so it's always better to check the safety side first, then focus on technology second. So even if you get halfway through the process and then you realize, human safety is the problem here, we want to double back and we want to pivot and start focusing on human instead of the technology, and communication is a part of that. We also need to make sure that we are documenting everything as we are going through the DRP process. So that way we can document things, disaster recovery team member can refer to them, and this will also be used to communicate with senior management, emergency services, and so on. So oftentimes a team will have what's called scribe or team spokesperson that will document everything and handle all of the communication, so the rest of us on the team can focus on our effort. And that makes sure that you have one point of contact for communication, everything's clear, concise, and they will be the focal point as the disaster recovery efforts are underway. There's also the training and awareness processes as well. The idea is here that again we are focused on human, we are focused on life, so we want to make sure that we are training and testing the DRP to ensure that all the processes and procedure are clearly understood by all the team members. And we also want to ensure that each individual understand their role and responsibility. This is going to include things like first aid, fire, chemical, suppressions, and so on. You might also wanna work in a crisis management, evidence collection, collaboration with emergency services, law enforcement, and more. There's a lot of different aspects, and it really depends again on where you are located in the world and what is more of a risk to you from a natural disaster perspective and also man-made disaster perspective as well. So the training awareness is very important because you want to make sure that your disaster recovery team knows exactly what to do and knows what their responsibilities are as they execute their procedure. Also within the DRP is going to be the response process. Once we activate it, now we have to respond. These are our processes and procedures that are going to define how we recover assets or how we respond to certain disaster scenario. So this is going to depend greatly on disaster itself. If the disaster is natural, if the disaster is flood, it's a fire, or it's a tornado, or maybe it's a hurricane, typhoon, whatever it is, this is going to dictate how we respond. And we also want to make sure that we activate the business continuity plan if our infrastructure cannot be restored within our tolerance level. Remember, as part of the business impact analysis, we set those tolerance level like recovery time objective, recovery point objective, and so on. If we are not gonna meet that objective, then we have to activate our business continuity plan because we have to focus on the business. So while we are still focused on human life now instead of focused on technology, we have to worry about how we are gonna get the business function back up and running. Okay, so I know there's a lot of thing going on here, but again remember the BCP is the driver here and DRP is just a small subset of overall plan. There's also personal process that needs to be included again because they are our top priority. We still want to make sure that they understand their roles, responsibilities, and potential response times. If something happened at 1 o'clock at morning, how long would it take our response team to get the facility or get to the recovery site and so on? That's gonna determine what we need to do next, what we need to do after that, or maybe we need to pivot and do something completely different, right? So that's gonna dictate some of those personal processes. Also keep in mind that during a disaster recovery situation, the stress is gonna be incredibly high. There's gonna be a lot of stress. So we want to make sure that technical personnel like system administrators, security administrator personnel, human resources, project manager, and member of our finance team clearly understand what needs to happen as part of this, and they need to have their procedure well defined as well. So we also want to make sure as a part of personnel process that we have primary and alternative personnel or backup personnel. So while we might have a primary operator or an administrator or a manager or what have you, we still want somebody to back that personal member up, because if they can't make it to the site, if they can't make it in, maybe they were part of a disaster and got caught up in, and unfortunately now they can't make it to site. We need somebody else who can step in and take over their responsibilities. So it's good to have primary and backup for each individual role in the organization disaster recovery. Then we also have the communication process. This is where we are going to clearly communicate to and from the organization in terms of what's happening within DRP. So anything that's happening, anything at all, we need to communicate that to all of our personnel. That way they know if the DRP is being activated, they need to update on the current situation. They need to specific direction or instruction on what to do next and so on. And again, you want that scribe or that spoker person, that point of contact, to communicate all of that, because in a stressful situation it's very easy to miscommunicate information. So as some people are working in different tasks. Some people perceive the situation just little bit differently. Some people see everything as a crisis. Some people are very even kneeled and they handle everything perfectly fine. So it's more of a big deal versus what not a big deal. So it's important to have that single and the recognizable voice in the organization to have consistent message throughout the entire disaster recovery process. So we want that single point of contact for all communication, especially when you are dealing with external entities like emergency services, law enforcement, and even the media at some level as well, and also within the DRP. We want all of our contact information clearly laid out in a table or a section of some kind, so that the point of contact can go right to the disaster recovery plan and know all of the different phone numbers or contact information they need to get a hold of the personnel that are required as a part of this process. We also want to clearly define our assessment process. So we want to assess the nature of the disruption to understand the extent and impact of any damages that has occurred at the facility. So when we investigate the disruption or the disaster, it's important to define the priorities of the impacts. Do we think this will impact our tolerance level? Is this going to impact sales or business transaction? Will this hurt the reputation of the organization? These are all things that we want to take in account. And of course, we want to look at, will any of the damage cause risks to the human life? And we want to define that investigative step necessary to assess the impact to the business operations. So again, we are focused on those tolerance level, and we want to triage this situation to understand exactly what's going on. So will this outage impact any contractual agreement? Was there any service level agreement in place with the customer and now we cannot meet that? Did this violate some kind of law, regulation, because proper protection were not in place? Right. It's better to get in front of things now so that you can clearly understand the restoration process and provide an accurate communication of what's going on. And once we have recovered and we have restored some level of operation, then it's time to start focusing on the restoration process itself, which is moving or relocating our recovery operation back to the primary operation location. Remember that recovering is defined as bringing back the normal condition, whereas restoring is defined as bringing back to the original state. So disaster recovery just means getting back to normal, right? Restoration is getting back to the original state, meaning moving back to our original primary operation location. Recovery would be standing up at the recovery site, whether it be in the cloud or whether it be in offsite somewhere. Okay, so in other words, recovery is bringing those critical business operations back online at the primary site, and as part of the process we should focus on least critical function and services and processes first, because if the failure occurs again or something goes wrong during the restoration, those critical business functions are still working at the recovery location and they won't be impacted. Okay, and then we have lesson learned. This is where we are going to evaluate everything we have done as part of the disaster recovery plan, whether it be a performance or personal, how the team did, how fast they got things up and running, the tolerance level impact, all those different things. Communication, was it effective? Did everyone knows what was going on? Did we got the hold of emergency services soon enough? All those different things we take into account, and that's gonna help us to identify what went right or what went wrong and determine any corrective actions that might be needed, and this can be help us to identify improvements in early detection of a disruption and prevention of a disruption, as well as overall response to the disruption as well. And this can help us identify improvement in early detection of a disruption and prevention of a disruption, as well as overall response to the disruption as well. So the bottom line for this video is to know the difference between business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning. Know the human life is always the top priority, especially with the question on this exam. If a human life is there, that is going to be a top priority. And then understand the purpose of each recovery process as well.